So, today I want to talk about the Florida State Board of Medicine voting to ban transitional care for transgender youth. Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida continues to use his position of state power to inflict violence upon people. Following the right wing culture war in the playbook of MAGA style fascism, he has used his power to systemically attack people in vulnerable positions in society, including but certainly not limited to immigrants, pregnant individuals, and of course, trans people. While this is far from the first time during his time as governor that he's targeted trans people, in this latest edition of the trans panic, DeSantis has attempted to use the state medical board, weaponizing the state agency, to ban doctors from being able to provide trans affirming care to teenagers. Meanwhile, he's made false claims about how young children are being indoctrinated and sterilized as part of this process, which is absolutely untrue, and yet he keeps talking about it and promoting it. Additionally, he handpicked his Surgeon General, Joseph Ladapo, both as part of the governor's anti-masking agenda, and of course in a further attempt to push forward a policy that openly denies the realities of medical science and medical consensus. This is being done in favor of a policy that would actively seek the enforcement of the gender binary and oppose any form of transition, including social transition in teenagers. Effectively, these policies end up causing psychological and physical harm, all in an attempt to obtain votes from people whose fear is being used to boost DeSantis' popularity in the polls and push him towards a potential fascist Republican presidential bid. That said, when it comes to enforcing this false understanding of medical science concerning gender, sex, and sexuality, we shouldn't even be surprised at this point. These are the same type of people who think it's okay when a 14-year-old cis girl is forced to give birth because it's, quote, God's natural order. It's the same type of people who think it's okay to perform so-called corrective procedures on intersex individuals as infants in order to confirm their bizarre worldview of a gender binary. It's the exact same types of people who would see no issue issuing a breast reduction to a teenage cis boy because it enforces the gender norms of our society and our world. And they are the very same people that have no problem barring cis women from athletic competitions and performing surgery on them if they are deemed to have too much testosterone by medical boards. After all, it's only biologically natural as long as it is a procedure that enforces their worldview of the gender binary and what they perceive as normal. They will continue to support their binary view that boys go in the blue box and girls go in the pink box. All the while, these people claim that there's a gender ideology in the industry. Meanwhile, they tell on themselves for believing a mythology about gender and sex that has been enforced through patriarchal and barely 101 understandings of biology, that goes against medical science and has been debunked time and time again. All of that said, let's take a look at some more information on the medical board vote to show you all what I'm talking about. Now we have here that the Florida Board of Medicine voted Friday to start drafting a rule that would bar all minors in the state from receiving puberty blockers, hormone therapy, or surgeries as treatment for gender dysphoria. Now this nonsense here is that they're banning surgeries when they never happen. It's not a thing that occurs. It's far more common for social transitioning and therapy to be provided in addition to puberty blockers, and with, of course, a certain amount of medical care and parental consent. Sometimes hormone therapy is applied before the age of 18, but usually around 15 or 16. But that surgical word being used there is a scare tactic, and it's done in order to make this seem as a much bigger issue than it is and to enforce the governor's lies. They make a law banning something that isn't even happening. Now, moving forward in this article, we find that the vote is the latest update in a months-long effort by Governor Ron DeSantis' administration to restrict transition-related care for people under 18. The effort to restrict such care began in April when DeSantis and Florida Surgeon General Joseph Ladapo issued non-binding guidance through the Florida Health Department that sought to bar both social gender transition and gender-affirming medical care for minors. The guidance drew backlash from LGBT advocates and medical experts. Accredited medical groups, including the American Medical Association, the American Academy of Pediatrics, and the American Psychological Association. Um, they've all supported gender affirming care for transgender youths. Meanwhile, we have, during all of this, they had a bunch of people come up and talk. And one of the issues that's involved here is that a number of the people who were brought up to talk at the beginning, especially the experts and then the people who were able to talk after, all were people who tended to support the governor's position and not really a lot of the people who ended up taking the other positions. For example, we have here Dr. Michael Laidlaw, an endocrinologist in Rockland, California, he cited often criticized research that found 50% to 90% of children whose gender identity isn't consistent with their assigned sex at birth, and that they grow out of the condition by adulthood. However, Dr. Meredith McNamara, an assistant professor of pediatrics at Yale School of Medicine, who treats transgender people between ages of 10 and 25, told the board that research Laidlaw cited and the June report issued by the Florida Agency for Healthcare Administration are methodologically flawed. Neither of the authors of the state review is a subject matter expert, McNamara said. One individual is a dentist. The other is a postdoctoral fellow in biostatistics. At a bare minimum, the systematic review should be conducted by those who are qualified to assess the literature. I wouldn't trust a dermatologist's review of the literature on a neurosurgical procedure, for instance. Now, they genuinely believe that they can lie to us by having a dentist and a biostatistician attempt to interpret the data on an issue that's not within their expertise. Now, unless these trans children need oral surgery during their transition process, the dentist should probably have no say on these children's medical needs during their processes that they go through with their own doctors and family. Meanwhile, we have tons of data and far more reputable sources claiming quite to the contrary, as we'll cover in a moment. But yet again, we have this culture war nonsense of picking fake experts to convince people that something nefarious is happening or that it's not exactly what it seems. And they do this in pretty much every issue. We've seen this when it comes to the climate. We've seen this when it comes to gay people back in the 90s and 80s. We've seen this type of thing happen time and time again. And this is just the latest variation of it. Now, the first 9 attendees who were able to speak outside of the expert's opinion were in favor of restricting gender-affirming care for minors. 8 of them said that they had detransitioned or come to identify with their assigned sex at birth, after having previously identified as trans. However, on the other side of things, there really wasn't much in the way of people being able to speak out. Now, one person who was able to speak out said that she and her family have consulted with medical professionals on medical care for their daughter, and that they have found that allowing her to go through male puberty would be psychologically devastating and psychologically damaging. So we do not make these decisions lightly, but they are decisions that should be made by families, not by the state and not by a board. And this is exactly the reality that we need to come to accept. These are decisions being made by families and their medical professionals. These are not things that the state needs to intervene in and start making all sorts of claims about and using the state's violence in order to prevent people from getting the care that they want and need. Now, another person who did get to speak, Jude Spiegel, the only trans person who actually was able to testify at Friday's meeting, which is very telling, because if you have an entire meeting that's 5 hours long and you only have one transgender person talking, that means that that perspective is not getting represented at all. Now, this person had read the names of 17 trans teens who died by suicide over living in a world that refused to acknowledge or accept them. Now, when it comes to all of this conversation about transition and detransition, we actually have evidence that 98% of teenagers who go on puberty blockers go on to take hormone replacement therapy. There's been a recent study put out, and this was published on October 20th, just so that we have an understanding here. And this is one of the most up-to-date and most accurately done tests on such a matter. And the findings were that out of 720 people included in the study, 704, which is 98% of people who had started gender affirming medical treatment in adolescence, continued to use gender affirming hormones at follow up. The age at first visit, the year of first visit, age and puberty stage at start of the treatment, age and start of the gender affirming hormone treatment, year of start of gender affirming hormone treatment, and anything else was not really taken into being associated with discontinuing gender affirming hormones. Basically, there was no reason to believe that any of these children would have gone through this process. And having 98% accuracy is amazingly accurate, and it demonstrates a high rate of predictability within people who provide this type of care. Yet, the people who are supporting the governor's position will cite a handful of cherry picked detransition cases as an excuse to prevent care to every teenager who actually needs it. Meanwhile, I cannot emphasize this enough. Detransitioning is not the same thing as getting off, say, puberty blockers. A lot of people conflate these things. If you decide to get off puberty blockers, there's no long-term implications or effects. You just get off puberty blockers and then proceed to go through puberty. That said, we also have to talk about the fact that we have historical evidence on our side to show that, again, these same types of strategies were used for those who were considered to be ex-gay at one time, usually from methods like conversion therapy. The sad reality is that many of those who are so-called ex-gay individuals were just shoved back in the closet. And while these decisions are both medical and personal, and certainly not for me to judge when it comes to things like detransition, it's hard not to imagine that for many, the social pressure of transitioning is something that forced a lot of people to end up claiming that they detransitioned, either through fear of loss of loved ones, or other procedures that they went through, or just social stigma. Now, getting back to some more information, with about 45 minutes left, the public comment period was canceled. They essentially said that with 45 minutes left, after all of the detransition people got to speak, and only a couple of people who were in favor of trans children being able to get access to the care that they need, they basically said one more person would be allowed to testify. The end. At one point, an audience member actually yelled out that trans youths would suffer if the board voted to bar care. The blood is on your hands, they said. To which one board member actually responded, "That's okay." This is the type of people who are making this decision. Now, which this frustrated, people because when they're all there and they see the fact that all the people who testified in favor of restricting care got to speak and not everybody else did, they said that this was obviously staged, adding that the board members didn't appear to know that much about gender-affirming therapies at all because they'd been fed a narrative and they ate it up. Instead, people were directed to send comments to an email address, because that's going to solve or do anything. Meanwhile, a Democratic representative from parts of Orlando had said that another meeting will be held on November 4th at the Holiday Inn in Disney Springs. Now, I do need to mention that these are being done in locations, like this current one was done in an airport, on an airport hotel, so that it was really difficult to actually protest outside, and so that the people who were flown in were able to get access to flying in. Again, they cherry-picked the different people that they brought in to speak out against this particular ruling. Like, they wanted to make sure that they had enough people brought in to specifically shoot down these ideas, and to make sure that the governor's agenda got accomplished. Now, according to this representative, they're going to discuss this drafted rule that they just created, and then there will be a 28-day approval process, which will include additional time for public comments. But the fact is that this is happening just before election season, and Governor DeSantis is clearly using this for his advantage. It's designed to avoid and, force people to not see issues around housing and inflation and price gouging and property insurance rates and the hurricane and everything else that's going on. They would rather that people who are in affluent positions, who are in these Republican MAGA mindsets, focus on the culture war, focus on the issues that are not really important to them, and, would be better served if they just let medical experts and people do what they needed to do. And instead, they turn it into this thing that's a distraction. You constantly in fascism see this type of thing, where one group is scapegoated in order for power to be accumulated. And so, this is just another example of the violence of the state being used against people, including both the trans teenagers themselves, who are going to immensely suffer from this process, and the families who are just trying to raise their children in ways that make them happier and healthier. And, this is just going to enable the types of parents who actively would seek to harm and closet their children. The outcomes of these decisions will be that families who are supportive of their children will actively need to try to seek options to flee the state if they want to live in a way that allows their child to have actual medical care. And those who can't flee, they'll be subject to increased scrutiny and denied genuine mental and physical health care, which could have a variety of negative consequences, ranging from increased depression all the way through self-harm and suicide. Especially if these teenagers are forced to go through the wrong puberty, especially when it could have been avoided if the state hadn't intervened and performed a form of violence against them. Puberty blockers and access to medical treatment is an obvious solution, and real doctors and medical professionals with expertise in these fields acknowledge this and promote these treatments. And while the governor of Florida, Governor DeSantis, has already weaponized the medical board in Florida, other states may follow suit in the near future. And we need to stand against it and face whatever happens here, because we cannot keep allowing state violence to happen in these ways that keep harming the most vulnerable populations. So with that said, if you've learned something here today, consider liking the video, subscribing, and leaving a comment, as well as joining my Discord. If you're in a financial place to do so, and only if you're in a financial place to do so, please do consider supporting me on Patreon, especially as political content like this can often be demonetized on YouTube, and it also goes a long way to helping me continue to make content like this. The links for everything that I mentioned are in the description down below. With that said, my name is Anarchist Tara. Thank you so much for watching.